Hello and welcome to Religion in America. Today we're going to be looking at some social theories that are not included in your textbook, but that I believe can provide some additional insights or at least some different ways of looking at how religion impacts society and how society impacts religion. So I'm going to pull up another PowerPoint presentation. And as I'm pulling this presentation up, I would like to point out that theories about the world are often useful to the extent that they clarify reality for us. And yet, in the process of simplifying complex reality, I want to point out that they also have limitations, they have flaws. You'll see some of these social theories are, in fact, in some ways contradictory. So these social scientific theories come from different disciplines of social science, starting with the culture wars thesis. And for me, this has been one of the most helpful ways of understanding religion in the contemporary United States. This thesis was first advocated by James Davison Hunter 30 or 40 years ago. And he argued that instead of the distinctions between Methodists and Baptists and Reformed, and instead of even differences between Catholic and Protestant and Jew, even to some extent, although again they correspond with the modernist fundamentalist debates. But today, the distinction between liberal and conservative has taken the place of some of these other distinctions and become far more important. Today, people are not fighting and dying about adult baptism versus infant baptism. They're not fighting and dying over how many angels can dance on the end of a pin or how many levels of hell and heaven there are. They're fighting over issues like abortion, gay rights, climate change, the election of President Trump. These are the kinds of things that are seriously dividing religious people in the United States today. So it's not just that people disagree and have different political, social views. The culture wars thesis suggests that increasingly people see this as a cosmic battle for the very soul of America. Conservatives emphasizing traditional values, religion, marriage, family, opposition to abortion and homosexuality. Um, on the other hand, you have liberal Protestants, liberal Catholics, most Jews, and increasing secular segment of the culture, creating what is often considered a progressive coalition, trying to address issues of systemic inequality, climate change, race and discrimination. Um, these are some of the issues that are most important on that side of the culture wars. Robert Wuthnow argued that these hostile camps of conservatives and liberals have become, as I said earlier, more important than many of the traditional distinctions among religions. So if you think about what it is that people are tweeting about, what it is they're getting angry about on Facebook, what it is that they're willing to fight about, or in many cases, I just don't, people get into their own little social bubbles. They have nothing to do with people whose values or whose perspective of the world is radically different from their own. To the extent you see that, then you would say the culture wars thesis is a helpful model. To the extent you look around and say, yeah, but wait a second, maybe I have some views that are more liberal in some areas and more conservative in the others, or maybe I recognize there are political differences, but it's not a war, then perhaps the culture wars thesis will be less inspiring for you. I do want to say that we're going to see the election of President Trump in some ways has highlighted some of the culture wars. Are we thinking about making America great again, going back to the 1950s? Are we thinking about how the 1950s women and minorities were not treated equally? People from other religious traditions were discriminated against. The world is moving in a more progressive direction. How do we see history? How do we see the world? The next thesis we're going to look at is 150 years old or so, the secularization thesis associated with psychologist Sigmund Freud, sociologist Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, philosopher. Um, Advocates of the secularization thesis suggest that society will advance, progress as people replace superstition with fact, faith with reason, as people reject traditional religions and embrace a modern perspective. Um, and there is some sense in which you can see evidence of secularization. Fewer people today are likely to explain disease in terms of God's will and more likely to explain it in terms of viruses and bacteria. Um, People are less likely to explain wealth and poverty and other things by appealing directly to God's will, and more likely to identify political theories, economic theories. There is a sense in which the world is much more secular. If we look at the public schools again, we see that they tend to be secular as opposed to reflecting traditional religious values. Fundamentalists are likely to be perceived as a dying gasp of people holding on to some worldview that's about to disappear. At least that's how advocates of the secularization thesis would see it. And while there's certainly some evidence that the United States today is more secular than it was, let's say, in the 1950s or earlier, there's also a sense in which many people continue to identify themselves as spiritual, as religious. Um, and so, to the fact that religions change over time, and we've already talked about that, that's hardly secularization in and of itself. Let's look at a competing thesis, which draws almost the exact opposite conclusion, which, if nothing else, shows us that sometimes people smuggle values and beliefs into social scientific theories. The elite secularization thesis, made famous first by Richard John Newhouse, argues that it's not the moral majority of Americans who are more secular, rather, it's those darn elites in the education, media, the courts, even the mainline Protestant churches. They tend to think of the modernist fundamentalist debates that modernity is a cul-de-sac traveled by these out of touch intellectuals, elites, but they imagine a future in which Christianity, a Christian America, will be restored. In fact, the 1950s will be more like what the future holds than, let's say, the 1990s. The Make America Great movement has often suggested that America was great before prayer was removed from public schools and Christian symbols were removed from government property. People said Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays. So you see that this elite secularization thesis assumes that the world will be more religious, not less religious in the future, and that these elites are part of the problem. The next social theory is the culture shift thesis. Engelhardt, Roof, Fuller, and others say that what appears to be a movement towards greater secularization in many cases is really just a shift from communal, organized religion to people dabbling in spirituality. Notice that instead of embracing a traditional set of doctrines or beliefs, individuals may engage in spiritual quests that draw upon Eastern religions, Native American traditions, philosophy, where each person kind of feels free to create his or her own religion. Um, the culture shift thesis argues that the world is no less spiritual, but its religious systems have changed in many obvious ways. The next social theory, the civil religion thesis of Robert Bellah and others, suggests that civil religion is in some sense the glue that binds Americans together. Regardless of your religious affiliation, even if you have no religion at all, as long as you somehow see the United States as blessed, you have a certain form of nationalism and see the United States as bringing about good in the world, that being a faithful American is that believing that America is God's chosen people. Again, you see echoes of um, Manifest Destiny and the Great Awakening. People, if they embrace civil religion, are likely to talk about desecrating flags. Notice if something is not sacred, you cannot desecrate it. To talk about the sanctity of documents like the US Constitution, perhaps even embracing notions like inerrancy to it, like they had at one point attributed to the Bible. In any sense, there are also critics of the civil religion thesis that argue that this form of nationalism itself can become a form of idolatry, worshiping the nation state as if it were a god. And there are others who feel that moving in the direction of civil religion would be a horrible mistake. The next social theory is the unconventional partners thesis. Um, Alexis de Tocqueville, quite some time ago, pointed out that when political freedom implied a 19th century man could do as he pleased, religion taught him that he should not do things that were destructive to his family or the community. Let me use an illustration: wearing face masks in a pandemic. On the one hand, we should be free to do it. On the other hand, we should constrain ourselves. In this way, he argues religion makes liberal democracy possible by instilling the values that prevent society from plunging into chaos. Instead of having a war of one against all where I can do whatever I want without concern for anyone else, that in fact religion provides this sense, he argued, that we have an obligation to promote the common good and not just to think about what's in my own short-term interests. Tocqueville pointed out that the separation of church and state ironically benefits both. And let me give you an illustration. Imagine we had no separation of church and state. Imagine the church of Barack Obama. How many members would it have? Imagine the church of Donald Trump. How many members would it have? And would the official institutional church sponsored, state sponsored church simply dramatically revise and say almost the exact opposite thing with every political election? De Tocqueville argued, of course not. Uh, Having church associated too closely with the state harms both. So, an interesting argument, obviously contradicting the argument of the elite secularization thesis that wants government to sponsor religion. Finally, the market theory. And according to advocates of the market theory, the strength of a religious institution depends on how much competition there is, because in the United States today, we have a lot of religious freedom and diversity, so you will find a variety of religious communities. You'll find some that support gay and lesbian rights, others that oppose it, some that say climate change is real, others that say it isn't, some that support a women's right to have an abortion, and others that insist that human life is sacred and that abortion would be murder. Notice the market theory argues that um, religious entrepreneurs will rise up to meet religious needs, and those institutions that can meet those needs and obviously also attract money will survive, and that those that cannot will die out. Well, there are a ton of social theories out there, but these are a few that I thought would be particularly relevant for you to think about. To what extent do these theories help us to make sense of the world around us, and to what extent do they actually distort the world that we live in? Thank you.